Among the old film reels of the 1970s and 1980s on those East Coast streets that were always damp, hurried, and filled with the sound of metal clashing against metal, there was one image that appeared so often it became almost invisible. The dark yellow checker cabs, square-bodied and unhurried, crawling through every corner like a natural part of the city. We see them in Taxi Driver, in The French Connection, in hundreds of other films, not as characters, but as the backdrop of America in that era. And precisely because of that absolute familiarity, hardly anyone ever asked, where did these cars actually come from? Who built them? A question that seems simple, yet opens the door to a little-known journey. The story of a small automaker outside the Big Three that carved its name into urban memory, with wheels that rolled for millions of miles. The story did not begin in a factory or on a Detroit boulevard, but in the dry cold of Smolensk, Russia, where a boy named Morris Markin, born in 1893, grew up in poverty and in the turmoil of pre-war Europe. But the fate of Cheka Motors was sealed in 1913, when Markin, just 19 years old, set foot on Ellis Island with empty hands and without knowing a single word of English. Right at the immigration desk, he was forced to borrow $25 from a janitor in order to be allowed to enter the United States. It was a small debt, but it became the doorway to an entire life. Chicago became the place where Markin built his new beginning. Starting only as a tailor, he worked tirelessly, saved every penny, and eventually bought the very shop where he had once been an employee. When the business flourished, Markin used that hard-earned money to bring his entire family, 7 brothers and 2 sisters, to America, as if trying to erase the borders that had once held them back. World War I broke out and brought with it an opportunity he could never have imagined: a contract to sew military uniforms for the United States Army. No one at that time could have predicted that the immigrant to tailor would become the father of one of the most iconic street images in America. But it was in this period that the first brick of Cheka Motors was laid quietly, firmly, and with unshakable determination. After World War I, with some capital saved from the uniform contracts, Markin turned his attention to another rapidly expanding industry: taxi service. In 1919, opportunity arrived when a body shop called Lumberg Auto Body ran into financial trouble. Markin lent them $15, a large sum for an immigrant who had only recently established himself. But just 2 years later, Lumberg went bankrupt, and instead of demanding every dollar back, Markin chose to take over the shop. That was the first turning point. The second came soon after, when Commonwealth Motors, a taxi assembler drowning in debt, approached him. Markin did what he had always done: turned wreckage into foundation. He merged the 2 small, struggling businesses into one. And in 1922, Cheka Kebab Manufacturing was born without fanfare. Just a modest taxi company in the vast ocean of Detroit, but carrying the ambition of a man who had once lacked even the money for immigration fees. Cheka quickly made a name for itself, not because its cars were beautiful, but because its operational philosophy was progressive. It was the first taxi company to hire African-American drivers and to require all drivers to pick up every passenger regardless of race. A bold stance in the 1920s. Cheka was not just selling cars, it was redefining the spirit of American taxi service. But as the company grew stronger, storms followed. In 1929, Markin purchased Yellow Cab from John Hertz. The deal immediately ignited the taxi wars, the battle for territory among major taxi companies. The streets of Chicago and New York became war zones. Cars were burned, drivers were assaulted, and gangs were hired to sabotage competitors. Cheka stood at the center of the storm. The peak of the violence came in 1923, when Markin's home was firebombed. No one was injured, but the message was unmistakable. Markin realized that to survive, Checker had to leave the fire zone. He relocated all manufacturing operations to Kalamazoo, Michigan, where Checker cars would later become the very soul of America's urban streets. And once Checker had established itself in Kalamazoo, Markin began creating true purpose-built taxis instead of relying on platforms from other manufacturers. And in 1928, the Model K was born. Not flashy, not showy, but pure Checker. A 120 wheelbase as solid as a steel beam. A Buddha 6-cylinder engine with only 27. 3 horsepower, but so durable that every driver trusted it absolutely. A taxi did not need to be fast. A taxi needed to never give up. The Model K was that philosophy in metal. In 1930, the Model M followed. The wheelbase was shortened to 122 in, but horsepower nearly doubled to 61. 5 Checker gradually became the standard of the taxi trade. Spacious, easy to repair, durable, and most importantly, born to live in the city. But then, in October 1929, the stock market collapsed. The Great Depression swept across America like a storm tearing apart everything most fragile. Factories closed, investors went bankrupt, and the streets became so silent it felt as if the entire nation was holding its breath. Checker, dependent on a struggling taxi industry, slipped into dangerous territory. Sales vanished. Customers had no money, and Kalamazoo grew so quiet that even the sound of a stamping press felt like a luxury. At that moment, a figure appeared like a shadow cast over the entire industry. Errett Loin Cord, the mogul behind Oren Cord and Duenberg. Checker was weak, small, and easy to swallow. And in 1932, when losses forced Markin to leave the chairman's seat, Cord officially took control of the company. Under Cord, Checker entered a strange hybrid era. The Model Y, a taxi whose design blended Orban-style elegance with Checker's inherent practicality, looked as if it were being pulled between two worlds. But the strangest part was not the design. It was what happened on Wall Street. That was where everything began to slip off its axis. Checker stock, long forgotten at $7, suddenly began to rise. It started with small buy orders, then larger ones, all coming from familiar accounts. Shell companies connected to Cord. It climbed to $15, $20, $40. Within weeks, Checker stock became the most irrational phenomenon in the darkest economic moment in American history. Then, one June morning, it hit $69, nearly a tenfold increase while the nation drowned in unemployment and bankruptcy. Seeing the irregularity, the SEC immediately stepped in. They traced every transaction, peeled back every layer of the shell companies. All paths led to the same center, Cord. When the investigation exploded, the Orban-Cord-Duenberg empire, already weakened by the Depression, began to crack. Stock values plunged, banks tightened their grip, and the financial markets completely turned their backs on Cord. And then, as if fate had arranged it, Morris Markin returned. With the stubbornness of an immigrant who had once survived on a borrowed $25 at Ellis Island, Markin gathered every remaining ounce of strength to buy back Checker just before the Cord empire collapsed. He did not just save the company, he reclaimed its very soul. In the late 1930s, Markin introduced the Model A 1939, a taxi embodying a new spirit. No partition, a driver's seat adjustable in 15 directions, heating, and sightseeing roof glass so passengers could gaze at the city. Checker did not just take people where they needed to go. It brought them into the urban experience. Then World War II broke out. Czech halted civilian vehicle production. The assembly lines that once stamped taxi frames now echoed with different sounds. Steel being shaped into military trailers, reinforced structures built for rescue vehicles, and most notably, a Jeep prototype with four-wheel drive powering both axles, a technology far ahead of its time. Checker's Jeep prototype was tested by the military in brutal conditions. Mud, sand, steep terrain, and endurance trials lasting for hours. Although it did not win a mass production contract, it proved something important. A small company in Kalamazoo still possessed the capability to create advanced military technology. Once again, that modest company proved it could bend with the times without breaking. But when World War II ended and America entered a period of reconstruction, Checker faced a challenge unlike anything before. All of its old stamping dies had been destroyed or damaged during the war. The frames that once supported the Model A were now only memories. Markin was forced to start from the beginning, not to repair, but to rebirth. To keep pace with the new era, he brought in two of the industry's top design minds, Herbert Snow, who had created the bold lines of Studebaker, and Ray Dietrich, the legendary luxury car designer of the 1930s. Both introduced a completely different way of thinking. Checker could not survive on durability alone. They needed a taxi of the future. And so, a series of ambitious projects emerged. First were the Model B and C, taxis with rear-mounted engines, cavernously spacious passenger cabins, and face-to-face seating like a train car. The ideas were beautiful, but reality was brutal. Production costs soared. Vehicle balance became difficult to control, and engine cooling turned into a nightmare. The project was canceled while still in the testing stage. Then came the Model D, the boldest creation in Checker's history. Front-wheel drive, transverse engine, technology a full decade ahead of Detroit. A 112-in wheelbase, a length of 189, 5-in, and a design optimized for urban life. In testing, the Model D ran more than 100,000 mi with impressive efficiency. It showed a future in which Checker could escape the shadow of being just a traditional taxi maker. But the price of realizing that future was too high. The production line would need to be completely replaced. Maintenance costs were steep, and drivers feared the risks of a new system. A small company like Checker could not pursue a technological revolution that even the Big Three were hesitant to embrace. In the end, Markin had to return to reality. In 1946, Checker introduced the Model A2, a temporary solution, blending an old chassis with a new body. Not flashy, not groundbreaking, but enough to keep the company alive in the turbulent post-war years. By 1956, the Model A8 was introduced. It was the moment when the classic matchbox silhouette of Checker was officially defined. A 120-in wheelbase, mandated by New York City regulations, a square body to maximize space, a long hood for easy service, and doors as wide as a garage opening so passengers could step in and out without obstruction. By 1961, Checker launched the Model A11, the taxi that would outlive any commercial vehicle in modern history. 20 consecutive years of production, a record even the giants of Detroit had never reached. The A11 was simple, sturdy, and so easy to repair that many drivers described it as a truck disguised as a taxi. They loved it because it refused to die, or if it did, it practically fixed itself with a few tools from the glove box. In 1962, Checker made a strategic decision to abandon the Continental engines. The 89 horsepower units, famous for durability but unprofitable due to low production volume. Instead, Checker adopted engines and components from General Motors, ranging from the 3.8L inline-six to the stronger 4.6L V8. Depending on GM allowed Checker to cut costs while drivers enjoyed greater power and reliability. But although the A11 was the soul of the city, the personal car market was a different story.